Steven's PSA was 8.3. His doctor ordered a retest in 3 months. Steven wanted to do everything right. He researched. He changed his diet. He exercised more. The day before his retest, he worked out intensely. Leg day at the gym, heavy squats, then a long bike ride home. I want my doctor to see I'm trying, he thought. Retest came back, 8.7, higher, not lower. Steven was devastated. His doctor asked a specific question. Did you exercise the day before this blood test? Yes, hard workout, squats and cycling. Why? His doctor explained something crucial. Exercise, especially intense exercise or cycling, temporarily elevates PSA. The elevation can last 24 to 72 hours. Research shows PSA can spike 30 to 50% after certain exercises. You essentially measured your PSA at its peak, not your baseline. Steven couldn't believe it. You mean the test result doesn't accurately reflect my true level? It's real, but it's temporarily elevated, not representative of your baseline. His doctor had him wait 3 full days with no exercise, then retest. Result, 7.9, 4/10 lower than the post-exercise test, lower than his original 8.3. The number I got when I was trying my hardest to be healthy was the worst number, Steven said, because I didn't know about the 48-hour window. Steven's story represents a pattern I've seen in my research. While details may be composite, the timing effect is well documented in published studies. Individual responses vary, and this is educational information to discuss with your healthcare provider. Today, I'm revealing the exercise to PSA test timing that most men don't know about. How exercise temporarily spikes PSA even when it's lowering your baseline long-term. The 48 to 72-hour window that matters. Which exercises cause the biggest temporary spikes? And the 5 exercises to avoid completely if your PSA is already elevated. If you're about to get a PSA test or your PSA keeps fluctuating, type timing in the comments. I'll send you the complete PSA testing preparation guide. This is educational information based on published research, not medical advice. Individual responses vary significantly. Work with your healthcare provider on all testing and exercise decisions. Let me show you what the research reveals. Exercise number 1, to avoid: cycling or biking. Cycling causes the most consistent PSA elevation. Research shows this clearly. The mechanism is straightforward. The bike seat puts direct pressure on your prostate for the duration of the ride. This mechanical pressure causes temporary inflammation. That inflammation elevates PSA. Studies show 30 minutes of cycling can raise PSA by 30 to 50%. The elevation lasts 48 to 72 hours. If you bike regularly and your PSA is elevated, this matters in 2 ways. First, timing. Don't cycle for at least 72 hours before a PSA test, preferably 1 week to be safe. Second, chronic effect. If you cycle daily or multiple times per week, you may have chronic low-grade inflammation. That ongoing inflammation keeps PSA elevated as a baseline. Research suggests men who cycle frequently have higher average PSA than non-cyclists, not because they have worse prostates, because chronic pressure causes chronic inflammation. The solution isn't necessarily to stop cycling forever. But if your PSA is elevated, consider this. Reduce cycling frequency while you're working to lower PSA. Switch to walking, swimming, or other non-pressure exercises. Once PSA stabilizes at a healthy level, you might reintroduce moderate cycling, but always avoid cycling before PSA testing. 72 hours minimum. 1 week is better. Exercise number 2, to avoid: heavy resistance training. Heavy weightlifting with maximal effort elevates PSA, especially exercises that involve the Valsalva maneuver. The Valsalva maneuver is when you hold your breath and strain during a heavy lift. Squats, deadlifts, bench press at maximal weight. This creates enormous pressure throughout your abdomen and pelvis. That pressure affects your prostate. Studies show PSA can rise 20 to 40% after heavy resistance training. The elevation lasts 48 to 72 hours. If your PSA is elevated, research suggests modifying your resistance training. Use moderate weights you can lift for 12 to 15 repetitions. Focus on controlled breathing throughout the movement. Never hold your breath and strain. Exhale during the exertion phase. This maintains the strength-building benefits without the extreme pressure spike. Research indicates moderate resistance training actually helps long-term prostate health. It's the maximal, breath-holding type that causes temporary inflammation. For PSA testing timing, avoid heavy resistance training for 72 hours before your test. Moderate resistance is probably fine 48 hours before, but heavy lifting needs more time for PSA to return to baseline. Exercise number 3, to avoid long-distance running. Long-distance running can temporarily elevate PSA. The mechanism is mechanical irritation from repetitive impact. Research shows runs over 6 miles cause measurable PSA increases in some men. The elevation is smaller than cycling or heavy lifting, typically 10 to 20%. But it still matters if you're trying to get an accurate baseline reading. Long-distance runners who run the day before testing may see artificially elevated results. The elevation typically resolves within 48 hours. If your PSA is elevated and you run long distances regularly, consider this. Chronic long-distance running may cause ongoing low-grade inflammation. Studies suggest runners over age 60 with frequent long runs have slightly higher PSA than moderate exercisers. This doesn't mean running is bad. Cardiovascular exercise is beneficial overall, but very long distances with high impact may not be ideal for prostate health specifically. For PSA testing, avoid runs over 5 miles for 48 hours before your test. Moderate runs under 3 miles are probably fine, but marathon training runs should be avoided for at least 72 hours before testing. Exercise number 4, to avoid intense spinning classes. Spinning classes combine 2 PSA elevating factors: cycling position and intense effort. The bike seat creates prostate pressure. The high-intensity intervals create systemic inflammation. Together, they can significantly spike PSA. Research on spinning specifically is limited, but studies on cycling plus intense exercise suggest the combination effect. Men who do spinning classes may see PSA elevations of 40 to 60%, lasting up to 72 hours. If you enjoy spinning and your PSA is elevated, timing matters crucially. Avoid spinning for at least 72 hours before PSA testing, preferably 1 week. Consider whether frequent spinning might be contributing to chronically elevated baseline PSA. You might experiment with reducing spinning frequency for 3 months. Substitute with other high-intensity cardio that doesn't involve bike seat pressure. Rowing, swimming, elliptical, or high-intensity interval training on foot. Then retest PSA to see if there's a difference. This gives you data about whether spinning specifically affects your numbers. Exercise. Number 5, to avoid certain yoga poses. Specific yoga poses can increase pelvic pressure, particularly inversions held for extended periods. Headstands, shoulder stands, and plow pose. These reverse blood flow and increase pressure in the pelvic region. For men with prostate inflammation or elevated PSA, sustained inversions may worsen inflammation temporarily. Research on yoga and PSA specifically is emerging. Some studies suggest inversions held for several minutes can temporarily elevate PSA. The elevation is typically modest, around 10 to 15%, but combined with other factors, it matters. If you practice yoga and your PSA is elevated, consider modifying your practice. Avoid inversions for 48 hours before PSA testing. If you do inversions regularly, consider whether they might contribute to baseline elevation. You might try eliminating inversions for 3 months and retesting. Keep all other yoga poses that don't involve sustained inversion. This gives you information about whether inversions specifically affect your PSA. Most yoga poses are fine and potentially beneficial. It's specifically sustained inversions that create the pressure concern. If you remember one thing from this video, remember this: the 48-72-hour rule. No intense exercise for 48 to 72 hours before PSA testing. This gives your PSA time to return to baseline. Here's your testing preparation guide. 1 week before your PSA test. Stop cycling or biking completely. This gives maximum time for any chronic inflammation to reduce. 72 hours before your PSA test. No heavy weightlifting or maximal resistance training. No long distance running over 5 miles. No spinning classes. No sustained yoga inversions. 48 hours before your PSA test. Light walking is fine. Gentle yoga without inversions is fine. Light stretching is fine. Swimming at easy pace is fine. But avoid anything that creates significant prostate pressure or systemic inflammation. The morning of your PSA test. No exercise at all. Rest, hydrate. Go directly to the lab. Following this protocol ensures you're measuring your true baseline PSA, not an exercise-elevated temporary spike. This can prevent unnecessary anxiety, additional testing, or even biopsies triggered by artificially high numbers. Here's what's important to understand. Exercise temporarily elevates PSA in the short term, but exercise lowers PSA in the long term. This seems contradictory, but research shows both are true. Moderate, regular exercise reduces chronic inflammation. Lower chronic inflammation leads to lower baseline PSA over time. Studies show men who exercise moderately have lower PSA on average than sedentary men. But the same men show temporary PSA spikes immediately after intense exercise. The key is moderate, regular exercise, not intense, extreme exercise, and not immediately before PSA testing. Research suggests the optimal exercise pattern for prostate health is moderate cardiovascular exercise 4 to 5 times per week, 30 to 45 minutes per session. Activities like brisk walking, swimming, moderate cycling, or light jogging. Moderate resistance training 2 to 3 times per week, controlled breathing, no maximal lifts, 12 to 15 repetitions per set, flexibility work, and gentle yoga without sustained inversions. This pattern provides cardiovascular and strength benefits without the chronic inflammation from extreme exercise or the temporary spikes that affect PSA testing. What to do if your PSA is elevated? If your PSA is currently elevated, here's my research-based recommendation. Follow the exercise modifications I've described. Avoid cycling, heavy lifting, long-distance running, spinning, and inversions for 3 months. Focus on moderate walking, swimming, light resistance training, and gentle stretching. Time your PSA retest carefully. No intense exercise for 72 hours before. No cycling for 1 week before. This gives you accurate data about your true baseline. Track your numbers over time. One PSA reading doesn't tell the whole story. Trends matter more than single numbers. If your PSA drops with exercise modification, you have valuable information. The exercise patterns were contributing to inflammation. If your PSA doesn't change significantly, other factors are primary. Diet, weight, supplements, or medical issues need attention. Either way, you've eliminated exercise timing as a confounding variable. Work with your healthcare provider throughout this process. PSA is one data point among many. Your doctor considers your age, digital rectal exam findings, PSA velocity, family history, and overall health. Exercise modification is one tool, not the only intervention. Stephen thought he was doing everything right. He exercised intensely the day before his PSA retest. His result, 8.7, higher than his original test. Then he learned about the 48 to 72-hour window. He waited 3 full days with no exercise. Retested, 7.9. Same man, same prostate, different timing. The lesson isn't to stop exercising. Exercise is crucial for overall health. The lesson is to understand timing and to modify specific high-impact exercises if your PSA is elevated. Avoid cycling, heavy resistance training, long-distance running, spinning, and inversions for 48 to 72 hours before PSA testing. If your PSA is chronically elevated, consider reducing or eliminating these exercises for 3 months. Focus on moderate cardio, light resistance work, and gentle flexibility training. Then retest to see if exercise modification makes a difference. You might be surprised. Many men find their PSA drops significantly just by changing exercise patterns, not because exercise is bad, but because certain exercises create chronic, low-grade inflammation. Removing that inflammation allows PSA to normalize. Comment timing below, and I'll send you the complete PSA testing preparation checklist, including the 48 to 72-hour protocol, which exercises to avoid, and safer alternatives that maintain fitness without prostate stress. If this information helps you understand your PSA fluctuations, please click like and share with someone who exercises and monitors their PSA. Subscribe because in my next video, I'm revealing the 5 foods that research suggests can lower PSA naturally when combined with appropriate exercise.